This is Business Decoded podcast with Ronnie Spellman. An informal chats with top business moguls as they share their stories of failure and success in a fun and relaxed way. Get entertained, educated, and unlock the secrets to success.
Welcome to Business Decoded with Ronnie Spellman. We're back with a friend, Stan Crow, who used to serve as the former chief executive at Northrop, Grumman, Japan. After a 20-plus year career in the Air Force, a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's a space and defense technology expert, and he deals with the evolution of global businesses. Right, so a phenomenal career, 35 years in the astronautical space as an engineer. And when we left off, you were just telling us about how you grew the operation at Northrop Grumman in Japan, and then why. And then we started talking a little about your evolution in the privatized space. And Stan, I'm amazed when I look at where we are today from a space exploration perspective, and the fact that you have businesses, private businesses around the globe, especially in the U.S., that are now exploring space. It's an incredible transition from those early days that you spoke about as a kid and seeing our astronauts go to space. Tell us about what you're doing in that space industry.
Sure, Ronnie, thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much.
It's good to have you back.
Having me on the show, yeah. This is an exciting time. As you said, so much is changing, and I think the inflection that we're in to try to figure out what it means and how to best take advantage of this environment as businesses,
right,
and as a society, and as individuals, right? You know, there's so many different ways to look at it, but it's an exciting time. And the reason that I am now working in this part of the business after the sort of called large institutional phase of my career, right? You know, with Air Force, with McKinsey, with Northrop Grumman. In all of these, one of the themes that sort of matured for me in thinking about this and a lot of the problem set that customers were looking for was, how do we improve innovation?
Sure.
How do we do things at a rate and in a way that will meet both the challenges and the opportunities that we see?
Right.
A lot of challenges. You know, we can point to any of those geopolitically or whatever it is, or environmentally. We can also look at opportunities as we see where we are on the cusp of expanding humanity further out into the solar system,
right,
and different things that in other domains that are in front of us from a technology perspective. Well, in order to get at those, a key theme that we have to be able to find a solution to is, how do we innovate faster?
Sure.
And we do that a lot. You know, the whole Silicon Valley kind of culture has shown us that this is possible in many domains, but aerospace and defense is not one where there had been as much of that up to a point. You know,
well, and don't lose your thought. I can completely understand why maybe some people wouldn't want to go fast, because you and I are old enough to remember the Challenger and O-rings, and I think a lot believe that if you go too fast, it creates a safety issue, and then you privatize the industry, and then you're going to have spaceships blowing up, and it's not happening. Like, we're successfully traveling. So keep telling us more about the need to innovate in that space and how we can do it safely.
Innovate and be safe. And I think that's exactly right. And so I think that there again, we look at the aviation industry as probably a good example, or other forms of transportation,
right?
Or where we have a certain amount of risk involved and a certain amount of system complexity that's involved. Private industry has shown the ability to take on risk of various types and to manage that risk effectively within certain domains.
Sure.
And so I think that's kind of the question, sort of like, where are we now with space, and are we at the point where some of that risk, not all of it, but in certain areas, is manageable by private industry? Or even if not as a lead, where can it follow and contribute in a partnership with government in many areas? Sure. And so I think both of those are good ways to look at it.
So if someone wanted to get into this space from an entrepreneurial standpoint, what would you advise them? So what kind of work, and at what stage? Like, are they components people? Are they building the space shuttle? Are they building engines? I know that Elon Musk builds his engines, I think, in Waco, Texas. And then he launches down near Houston. And then Blue Origin, I think, is out in West Texas. So there's a lot of activity in Texas, and you're in Texas now. You moved from California to Texas. But where would a business start to think about, how do I get into this arena?
Well, that's a great question. And there are a number of different avenues. And it just kind of maybe broadly categorize it as either direct or indirect.
Sure.
And a direct approach would be to say, clean sheet. I am going to start, from the ground up, doing something that's new and it's directly focused on the space ecosystem. And I agree with you. Texas is a really dynamic location in the country for that. There are a number of others as well. And, that can start with any of your sort of market screens of what are some of the opportunities that I can see on my horizon that I can go serve a need.
Right.
It's generally hard to do that just as a single individual.
Right.
So you need some partners, and you need to kind of understand, what talents you can bring into that. There are a number of those that can be apparent through maybe an engineering department at a university, or through a partnership with another company that's looking at parts of this ecosystem. I generally say, though, that that's kind of a harder way to do that, unless you're in a program and you are able to start to see a need and say, well, I already bring a talent to this, or I bring some perspective,
sure,
or I can go, I can bring capital into this situation. That another way to come at it is indirectly, and that would be from starting with another capability that one has already developed. It could be software, or it could be a manufacturing process, or it could be something that does communications or handles some capability in, say, controls or a building structures or something like that. I can see how this can then be adapted to a use that can touch into the space industry. Right. So it's an adjacency, we would call that.
Sure.
There are more and more of those that are starting to open up. And that's because of the maturation of what's happening in the space industry. That it used to be that the only way to do it was the former one I talked about, this direct route where you had to really be focused on something that would be highly customized and highly specialized for space use, and other things that we would do for other purposes wouldn't fit the bill.
Sure.
They wouldn't be relevant. But that's starting to change now.
Now, so what you mentioned about the universities and having some kind of expertise and then getting into it, but so many business entrepreneurs are just entrepreneurs. They don't have an expertise in a given area. For someone like that, I guess either they can come in as just an investment partner if they have some capital to work with, or they can partner with someone else that's that technical expertise. I think back to the likes of maybe an Apple. I think Steve Jobs was more of a marketing guy, but he had a partner that understood the technology. What are you seeing from a dynamic and people getting into the industry? What beyond that, are you seeing any just pure entrepreneurs? Like, what are you seeing from an ecosystem?
That's a great way to think about it, because you do need these different complementary talents. And, somebody can bring that business sense, or somebody can bring the ability to raise funds, to tell a story. We talked about in the program the other day about how the storytelling of the why something matters is really important to engineers. Well, it's also important to the entrepreneurship process, because this, again, is just another form of value creation.
Right.
So understanding that linkage between what a thing is or can do, how I'm going to make it, and who's going to buy it, what need it's going to serve. Seeing all of those and understanding that itself is a skill. And it's different from the deep technology knowledge.
Right.
And so that, an entrepreneur really tends to be able to look at those three parts of a value equation and then start to have almost a process specialization of testing and diagnosing. Is this technology going to actually serve a purpose, and am I going to be able to make it and commercialize it in a way that's going to make sense? That's what an entrepreneur is going to do, independent of the technology.
Is there a way they can go to incubate these days? I know a lot of universities have incubator systems, but because this is so new in many respects, where can they go to kind of refine that and then establish a ecosystem that supports maybe an idea that they have?
Sure, there are opportunities in universities. There are space-oriented venture funds at various stages that can look at either.
Where can they find those? Will they find those in Texas, California? Where do you see the biggest concentration of those space-based venture funds?
I think they are diversifying. Historically, a lot of this has spun out of course, Silicon Valley.
Still in Silicon. Okay, interesting.
But it is expanding into other areas. And
okay.
So, I don't think it's geographically limited there anymore by any means.
What's neat is Hughes, I think, was started mostly in Southern California. The technology push has been in technology, and the silicon graphics and those types of technologies are up in the northern part of California. So it's fascinating to see it become a little bit more geographically dispersed now.
Well, let me talk about, we were talking about Texas. So we talk about, we've got a number of fantastic universities here in the state of Texas, and myself, I'm almost coming on 3 years as a Texan and a Dallasite, and very, very excited about that. And certainly here, in Dallas, in Houston, Austin, Texas A&M, we've got a lot of really first-rate engineering capabilities, and each one of these, so many of them are now, they just recognize the value of this partnership with private capital,
right,
with opportunity to create entrepreneurship programs. Mm-hmm. And so, if one is kind of at that stage, those are great places to go. And each one of them is a hotbed of opportunity.
Right. And in North Texas, the Dallas area, you have Texas Instruments, which is just an incredible place from a technology standpoint, and the chips that are used in so many different items, from medical devices to, I presume, space exploration.
Yes.
So, and then most people don't recognize this, but Texas Instruments essentially founded the predecessor school that evolved into the University of Texas at Dallas. And they have an incredible engineering program.
That's right. Yeah. And there's a lot of heritage, and then also we talked in our previous show about my background in Japan.
Right.
Texas Instruments also had a very an important role in relations with Japan.
Interesting.
And they had a very large Japan presence as well. So the connection between Texas and Japan, and with Texas Instruments as one of the leading kind of institutions that help bring us together is
fascinating.
A great example of that.
So one of the items you just mentioned was why something matters, and that was a question I had for you. For any business in the U.S. or even around the globe, why is space important? Why does it matter that we spend time in space? Like, I know we have a bunch of satellites up there, which people don't connect the dots between our cell phones and satellite usage and television usage, but why is space important, especially to a business leader?
Yeah, so there are a number of answers to that question. So if we're going to talk about it from a business standpoint, then there's sort of the direct financial sort of why is this potentially a business growth opportunity lens one can apply. But there's also sort of why am I in business in the first place?
Right.
What am I trying to accomplish? The sense of purpose that maybe goes a bit beyond just a simple question of financial returns.
Right.
So in terms of why this is interesting from a business standpoint is that we're seeing, I'd say, both from a government-oriented emphasis in space, there is an increased recognition from a defense and security standpoint. So based on geopolitics, there's space is an area that is a contested domain, as the Space Force talks about it. And so recognizing that there's a certain amount of a need to help, like in so many other domains in our life, air, or land, or water, or cyber, to make sure that we have the right kinds of defensive capabilities there. And so there are investments associated with that. The other side of it, again, I'm sticking with the government for a minute, is I'll call it the optimistic part of the flourishing of humanity and science and knowledge, and the exploratory part is also on the cusp of real opportunity here. Sure. We have the Artemis program, and we have the expansion of, we're going to have humans back on the moon again here soon, and the potential to expand out into the solar system in a more substantial way within this century. Interesting. And that morphs very seamlessly really into the commercial opportunity,
Right.
because this isn't just a government story anymore.
Right.
And the commercial opportunity, certainly, we're seeing things like satellite communications being, this whole explosion of things happening in low Earth orbit that is completely different from the way people envisioned space playing out, is changing the dynamics in the space economy. And so there's real opportunity there. So those are just kind of three quick examples to say, why does it matter from a business standpoint?
Low space orbit, what's in the low space orbit that would be intriguing to people?
Yeah, low Earth orbit.
Yeah, low Earth orbit.
Yeah, low Earth orbit. So low Earth orbit is the area where, and it contrasts, fundamentally with geosynchronous orbit or higher orbits that are further away from the Earth, where traditionally communication satellites went out to this area about 22,000 miles away, because they could sit there in their orbital speed. If you just bear with me, I'm waving my hands here, and I know people who are listening to the podcast won't be able to see my hands wave, but as the Earth rotates, there's an orbit that goes around at the same speed, and so a point above the Earth will seem to be fixed if you're at this geosynchronous orbit. It's a very efficient way to have a satellite there that can communicate, for example, to a point on the Earth. And so historically, that was a very efficient way to send satellites up and to go do things from a communication standpoint. What we've seen revolutionize the way things are happening now with Starlink, for example, is putting many more satellites, but putting them much closer to the Earth.
Okay.
So now they may be, 700 miles up or 500 miles up, or, even lower.
Sure.
And so, and in these ranges, they are able to cover the Earth with more satellites, but you have a shorter response time for your signals, and less power is needed, for example, to do the things you need to do from a communication standpoint.
Sure.
So that's really been taking off for a number of reasons. And it's also the area where the space station flies, and where a number of other opportunities are going to be coming up commercially. There's some other advantage to not only does it take a little less energy to get up to the low Earth orbit, it's also a little better protected for humans because it's better protected from some of the radiation that exists further out. So it's a great place to go and kind of start our next big beachhead in space.
Okay. Now, you mentioned some of those commercial opportunities. So I think it's helping not only with Starlink, right, and that kind of communication, but weather forecasting. I presume they're getting maybe some good information. But what else? What else would be a commercial opportunity? What are you seeing in the future of commerce and business and entrepreneurship in that realm?
Yeah. Thanks, Ronnie. So there are actually many different opinions on what's going to be the next big thing.
Sure.
If I were to characterize where we've been, communications and things like that, where space has been useful for needs on Earth.
Right.
That's been very well established for decades.
Right. Okay.
So, it's not for, it's the phrase is space for Earth.
Sure.
Stuff happens because of space, but the beneficiaries are here. Our cell phones, our GPS, all of that, we benefit from it here. Right. It just happens to leverage systems that are in space. And that's by far the largest part of the space economy.
Gotcha. Okay.
So the first point for any entrepreneur is, if you're thinking about doing something in space, you don't have to go to space.
Right.
You can do it on the ground,
right.
And you can do it with software applications that take advantage of these systems that are up there.
Right.
And there are now satellite as a service kinds of companies that are doing things where they'll give your sensor, or they'll give your satellite, or they'll run your constellation for you, and you can just concentrate on the value-added application that you would do here.
And that's really fascinating. If you don't mind, Stan, let's talk about the satellite as a service.
Sure.
Right. So we have software as a service, but this is a new SaaS, right? So what does that feel like for an entrepreneur, having satellite as a service? What do you do with it? How does it operate? How does
let's
it function?
suppose that I have this idea that what I really want to do is I want to help people. I'm making this up, but track their. I want to track quail migrations, and I think that's going to be an interesting thing to do, and that there'll be people who are interested in this, and that I have some idea of how I'm going to do this from space, based on cameras or based on beacons that we're going to put on the whales or something like that, and we'll read them from space. Then historically, if I was interested in doing that, I'd have to go hire a bunch of satellite engineers and rocket scientists and communications experts, and I'd have to go build some satellites to go put up there to do this business. But now I don't have to do that.
That's really interesting.
Because now I can just think about, okay, who is it who really wants to track these whales and understand what they're doing? And I can go to a company that does a satellite as a service because they build these.
Right.
And they're available. You can find fixed price catalogs online. You can say, here's how much it'll cost to do this.
That is really cool.
To whatever. So the cost is down and the technical complexity is down. So all of that would say the barrier of entry into this for somebody who's going to have a creative idea. It's now getting much closer to the idea of an app on my smartphone.
That is really neat.
Where I just need to think about the app.
So it's pretty soon to be like Uber, right? You just dial it up on your app and buy satellite as a service.
Well, literally, that's correct.
That's fantastic.
Yes, yeah. And he would use smartphones actually even as interface. Yes.
In some respects, it's like buying space at a data center.
Correct.
In some respects. And are there satellite brokers that can facilitate it, or do you have to who do you look for that entrepreneur that might consider this as an option?
You could probably go through a middleman service, but it's actually probably not that complicated to just go do a little checking and find those who are vending in this arena and then do some evaluation yourself.
That is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
So what's next for you in your journey now in space and new technology related to space? What are you working on, and what's next for you?
Well, I'd say it's two things, and I'll say both. And we're primarily a business show, so I could talk about the for-profit, but also there's the why question, and so there's the part about the, I think, nonprofit,
sure,
and particularly about.
Well, we can talk about that as well. So feel free to talk about both.
Yeah, why don't I just touch briefly on each, and I'd say in the creating the conditions to continue, and they both relate in this sense,
right?
Creating the conditions to continue to expand this. Wave of innovation that we're having. That's what's really important.
Okay.
Right? And there's a set of those that have to do with a combination of some government policies, basically the environment for private investment to continue to be attracted and effective in this area, and to continue to have some of the mechanisms for this space economy to become more diverse, so that it's not just a single large company that's able to do things, but lots of little companies.
Okay.
Keep driving those barriers to entry down and make this collaboration available, not just in the U.S., but globally.
See, and that's good for our listeners to hear, that you don't have to be a Northrop Grumman to play in the space.
Correct. Yeah. That's right. So that's all I'd say on the for-profit side, is how do we help the ecosystem to continue to diversify, to continue to be entrepreneur-friendly,
right?
In a number of respects. On the nonprofit side, so another activity I'm involved with is World Space Week Association, and this is chartered under the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And so this is there's one set of international treaties about how we've all agreed as humanity that we're going to approach outer space, and the United Nations is the place where this resides. And one of the activities that they designated was this period in the 4th to 10th of October every year called World Space Week, which is specifically about raising the awareness of space all across the globe.
Right.
So this goes back to our discussion in the previous episode where we were talking about engineering, STEM, encouraging people to see the why that all of this is important. So World Space Week Association is really building this awareness.
That's fantastic.
I've just been honored to be named the chairman of the board for this group,
wow.
and I really believe in their mission.
Where are they based?
So World Space Week itself is a global activity without a specific location. And like I said, we're headquartered under the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in Vienna.
Okay.
But we have a very global team, and that's by design. And the purpose there is, along with some other things that I think are important in this area, is about raising that awareness, raising the sense of opportunity, so that no matter where a young child is. And we talked a little bit about my background last time, growing up in Idaho and looking at the stars and watching the moon landing, whatever. You could be growing up in South America, you could be growing up in Africa, you could be growing up in Asia, North America, wherever you happen to be, and in Europe. And we want the next wave of humanity to see space as an opportunity, and to understand what that can mean for them, even if they don't directly become space entrepreneurs or astronauts or whatever the motive is, but they understand that it's there and they don't think that that's something beyond them.
Right.
That's the goal.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing to look back what seems like not very long ago and think that people thought the earth was flat, right? But just the idea of being able to look at our world and then think beyond our world to look at the rest of our outer space is just amazing. Yeah, and for me, it's really inspiring. So your wave of innovation, I think you had some points about the different waves. Can you quickly walk us through your philosophical approach to those different waves and the evolution?
Sure, and I just, and this was a little bit of a framework that I'd mentioned in one of the articles that I published a little while ago in Space News, and it was about the third wave of the innovative space economy.
Okay.
And so the point on that was simply saying that we shouldn't expect that innovation happens in a nice, straight, linear fashion.
Sure.
It's a little messy.
Right.
Sort of like being on the ocean and you get tossed around a little bit.
Right.
But you can, I think if we look at it, there's a way to characterize a couple of different waves that have occurred. And, one of the first ones was the wave that was really driven by SpaceX, which fundamentally changed people's minds to the idea that private investment and private entrepreneurial activity could really be applicable in this domain, that this was not strictly a government domain anymore.
Okay.
Then there was probably a second wave that where initially once this idea took root, it seemed like any idea was a good idea, and one could sort of a lot of enthusiasm, and not all ideas that were hatched were probably robust.
Sure.
And so we've gone through a little bit of a correction, I think, in some of the entrepreneurial activity and enthusiasm for investment, in the last few years, and that's appropriate. That's healthy. As you kind of every business cycle, you've got your ups and downs.
Very true.
And people characterize that in different ways, but and then when I talk about a third wave, I'm thinking really about it's where we are now based on a lot of the great effort that has happened, even if not all of these sort of second wave efforts were really came all the way to fruition. They've advanced in many areas. And so we're now in a place where we can start to look at some different characteristics and different opportunities in the market where we can build on those foundations and carry forward in a slightly different way. And it's more about cross-linkages and cooperations and partnerships rather than just, single big innovators coming in.
And I think you mentioned in that third wave that there was a drop-off in investment in 2021.
Right.
Has that changed now that we're in 2024?
I'm in this daily, right? This is part of where I live these days. And so I think that the experience of many people right now is that there continues to be, for a lot of reasons, not just space-related. These waves are also influenced by other macroeconomic factors and things going on. And so generally speaking, some of the venture investment at the moment is being a little cautious. Okay. But I think that the opportunity, I also see more willingness increasingly recently to recognize opportunities that have proven themselves and to begin to re-engage. So I think
a drop-off isn't necessarily bad.
No.
I mean, as you mentioned, we go through cycles and everything, whether it's housing or any other marketplace, and sometimes it's just a little correction. Well, you probably remember the whole .com boom, like in the 90s, especially the late 90s. Anything with .com attached to it was well valued, and then it just died. we had a market correction, and then the same thing happened in the housing industry. So it sounds like as maybe the industry matures, the privatized space industry matures, people become a little cautious just to make sure that we're moving in the right direction.
I fully agree, and this is again where I'm, I'll sort of make a Texas plug here, if I may, because seeing the investment community outside of the space domain in so many areas here in Texas. What's very refreshing to me is how the sort of clear-sightedness to value creation is very important. And understanding whether it's real estate or construction or power or even in energy and a number of areas, that the understanding of what the basis of value creation is and the ways to control risk and that sort of mature way of looking at investment is starting to, I think, be applicable now in space as well, because the participants there can actually withstand that scrutiny.
Sure.
And they can explain their stories.
Right.
And it's not just as much about an engineer's dream that needs to be believe in a vision and invest. Right. But there's also those other levels of credibility down beneath that.
So what's neat to me, I know we're at the end of our program, Stan, but what's fascinating is to take that journey of this young man in Idaho, this young kid, you, 6th grade, and having this vision of space, seeing some of the early astronauts go to space. You didn't go to space, but I think your impact on the space industry now that you can look back over those years is incredible. You're really shaping the future of space today through your work. And I find that amazing. You're probably having a bigger impact on the space industry than having gone to space in many respects.
Well, I can't speak to that, and I will just caveat, I hope that the stories haven't gone to space yet. I'm still not giving up, as I said. But, we'll keep an eye on what that looks like. But I think that's the point, though, as you said, in all seriousness, that finding the way that we can contribute, which may not be exactly the way we think it's going to be, but being willing to do that dance with reality and discern what our path is going to be based on what we try and that dialogue back of sort of what works. That's life, right? And that's rewarding.
I think back, and we'll end here, but I think back to my time at NASA. There was an engineer that was working on flying vehicles. That was his whole program. This was in the early mid-'90s. And I think everybody else thought he was just in some other orbit, right? It just didn't make sense to them, the idea of flying a plane. And we were at that point. We were talking about autonomous flying planes in the U.S., and when I look at space, it's kind of the same thing. Just not long ago, the idea of being able to really go to space like we're doing today, privatized, and the energy around the space is so far different. And it's really neat. So I appreciate your work in that space. Is there anything you'd love to leave our Business Decoded listener about the space program and your work before we end the program?
Yeah, if I were just to say something in parting, I would say that it may not be for everybody to do something in space now, but keep your eyes open, because it's coming, and there'll be more opportunities, and it will touch more and more people as time goes on, and so it's worth thinking about, and it's worth thinking about whether it's for a business purpose or whether it's for thinking about what it means inspirationally. To those who are thinking about our place on the planet with our other fellow humans on this planet. And the one last thought I leave is broadly philosophical about the overview effect that many people talk about. The astronauts when they're in space and they look back on the Earth, and it's a little cliche, but it actually is really true. That you look down on the Earth and you're not looking at national boundaries. You're recognizing how precious our life on the planet is, what a gift it is, and the responsibility that goes with that for us to continue to be co-creators and help to advance where we can go into the future. So I think that's what inspires me.
That is so neat. Well, I hope there is a young Stan in Idaho or someplace around the world in 6th grade that's listening to the program and thinking, I'm going to be that next person to follow in these footsteps and create the next wave in the space race.
Awesome.
Stan, thank you for joining Business Decoded. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you for listening to Business Decoded podcast with Ronnie Spellman. Please be sure to subscribe and share, and stay tuned for more incredible Business Decoded episodes.